Hi, my name is Lynn and I'm studying to become a B.C.B.A. This particular video is a part 2 of a previous video of Unit 9 from class BEH 5043. The title of the unit is the Science Practitioner Model, and so it was a long one. It was a long unit. So if you need to look at the part 1, please go watch that part first, because then this part covers the rest of it. Okay? Where we left off was the anatomy of an article. So we've already discussed how to search articles and why we use them. But now we need to go into what is an article. So an article will consist of a title, abstract, an introduction, basically, of what they're doing, methods, results, and discussion and references. So a title is hopefully self-explanatory. It explains the whole purpose and whole point of what the article is. An abstract is basically a 250 word or less summary of what was determined within the article. It might reference a few things within its methodology, but it will always talk about part of the results so that you can get a pretty good idea of what you're about to jump into when you read the article. So an abstract should be a really quick snapshot of what you're looking for so you can determine if this article discusses the topic you need. From there, it goes into the intro. So usually the intro will provide some history of the topic. It'll say why this particular publication was made, like why this article was made, because it says like, we noticed in previous research that they answered this question, but there was a confounding variable. So we want to take away that confounding variable and replicate this and try and see if we can get the same results or determine if different results will occur. From there, it goes into the methods. So this will tell you when they did it, how they did it, how many people they partook in the experimentation, their measurement parameters, if there are any other confounding variables that may occur within the variability of making the experimentation, and also how they tried to combat any threats to validity, right? From there, they would go on to results, which is basically disseminating. This is where you'd find the graphs. So this is where they would graph the data. They would discuss what they found from it and how they took the data, if they excluded any data and why. And then in discussion, they would say, what are the impacts of the results from what they did? So basically, it's kind of like a culmination of like, here's what we found. And also usually it'll say, this is the direction we could go with it. If you have any further, if you want to know what further topics we can discuss within this. So let's say they were like, okay, so we took care of that confounding variable, we found these results, we believe this interprets this way, so now we want to say that you should, if you're interested in this type of research, you should look into why did the confounding variable do this, or why did it go there? So it tells the future direction of the research, where it should go at least, or where the scientist thinks it should go. So you'll find all that in the discussion section. And then references should reference any previous topics that they looked into before they established this particular experiment, and will give you further readings essentially. So if you are still interested in that topic, you can see where the researchers started off from as well. So you can kind of see if you can replicate it, or if you can go into that particular topic if you have more questions about it. Now that we know how an article works and how it's broken down, we can discuss when we identify them and how they're presented to us and how we can trust them. So every article is given what's called a DOI number, which is a digital object identifier. And so anytime you need to research something, if it's published or established, it will have this number, so you can reference this number quickly instead of having to type out the entire year and title and everything else. You can just have this reference number. From there, they discuss the quality of article research. So this is when you try to make sure that the studies have all the components needed to be effective research, right? So you want to make sure that they did try to battle confounding variables. You want to make sure that they actually, if they, let's say, did a multiple baseline, that they actually followed a multiple baseline method, rather than just saying like, oh, we had like 6 kids, and because there's 6 baselines, we just introduced all the treatments at once. That's not a multiple baseline, right? That's just having multiple kids experience the treatment all at once. So it's hard to tell what exactly changed. From there, they also discuss rigor, which is the extent to which an independent variable is planned and implemented in a manner that produces the convincing outcomes. So rigor and quality are usually conflated, but rigor is a bit more stringent on is this actually what it is, versus quality, which is, did they use a good enough sample size? Did they actually have a double-blind study when they say they had a double-blind study? Do not conflate quality and rigor is a big point that they try to make. The next topic they cover, it's a little hard for me to say, contraindictions are signs that a design isn't appropriate. So something as simple as using duration data instead of frequency data. If something doesn't have a long duration, then that would be a sign that the data is probably going to be a little off, because that's not the correct data that you should have been taking, or they use a multiple baseline for a really highly aggressive behavior that should not use a multiple baseline. When you see these items, you got to make sure that you're kind of bringing them up to say like, hey, is there a reason why you chose this? Like, you can contact the writers and be like, what's going on here? It's highly doubtful that those types of things would be noted in a published study, because they would be caught during peer review, which we'll get into shortly. But that is one thing that a peer review would look at when they are discussing whether or not they should publish the study. From there, it goes into acceptable procedural fidelity, and that is adherence to conditions of a research design. So if you're running everything in a single location, are you maintaining that single location's surroundings and environment? Are you changing it without realizing it? Something as simple as changing the temperature in a school can actually change something, right? Like, these are little confounding variables. But if you suddenly say like, oh, because they changed the temperature, we decided to run this in the playground, but we're still doing the same thing. Well, that's a huge change all of a sudden, right? You're not constraining yourselves to acceptable procedural fidelity because you've decided to change the location, but because it's on school grounds, you still consider it a school when it's a completely different location within the school, right? Oh, they also call it procedural reliability because it has to be reliable. From there, they talk about validities again. So ecological validities are how well the natural setting relates to a research setting. So for instance, if you decide to do research on whether or not a principal can teach a class better than other teachers, that's not entirely ecologically valid, because how often are principals teaching classes versus a teacher teaching a class, right? Another one is external. So external validity is, can the research carry over to the natural settings? It relates research setting to a natural setting. It almost overlaps with ecological, but realistically, one thing that they brought up is the fact that if the research occurs in what's considered a reinvented natural setting, but doesn't carry over to the actual natural setting, that's where it's not actually having external validity, because for whatever reason it's not carrying over even though you tried. Versus ecological validity, you tried to teach math while bungee jumping and you found out it was really highly successful, but not every kid's going to go bungee jumping to learn math, right? So it's not really it can't relate the natural setting to the research, right? From there, there's social validity, and this is an interesting one. And social validity doesn't really care about the overall scientific aspect of it. It's asking, is it socially acceptable? So one example I can come up with is electronic shock therapy. That's highly controversial, at least here in the United States. And it's used in it's a tool, right? It's not really socially valid. It has been shown to be valid to treat certain things, but socially it's not valid because people do not support it. People don't want to use it. So if people aren't willing to use it, is it really actually useful? So that's what social validity is asking. From there, it goes on to things like generalization, maintenance, are order the conditions random? Like, it's asking all these questions within rigor. Then the unit walks into standards of articles and publications. So there's a minimum criteria for standard components for articles in general, like peer review and whatnot. But there's 3 types of standards that this unit covers. One of them is called Horner et al. 2005, which is considered a standard because it is the most cited article within developmental psychology and ABA as far as I understood the unit to discuss. But it is the most cited article at the very least within ABA research because it took a bunch of kids and tested what is considered normal, right? Like, or what is considered to be expected. So how do we know that a 2-year-old should be able to like walk and do this and this? It's because we tested a bunch of them. So that's from Horner et al. They created somewhat set of standards. And then What Works Clearinghouse is a United States Department of Education sector that goes through publications and clears them and makes sure that everything works out well. So Horner et al. 2005 is the most cited article, so it's kind of held to that standard of like, this is a really good article, everything's standardized. Is it the end-all be-all of standardization? Definitely not, because it's a single article, right? And it definitely has some flaws, but What Works Clearinghouse, being government run, tries to go through and clear what is expected of an article. From there, there's also CEC quality indicators, which is kind of like as far as I understood, it's like a checklist of things that it goes through. And then there's WWC, which is 3 levels of clearing essentially. So it's meets standards, doesn't meet standards, or meets standards with reservations. It goes into further depth of these particular standardizations, but it's a little unclear to me how they all work because they are agencies in their own right, except for the first one is clearly an article. So it was hard for me to understand what exactly that was being used as, but it was just I think a golden standard that people were trying to hold themselves to when they were doing articles. If I'm wrong, you can go ahead and throw that in the comments, but from what I wrote in my notes and from what I remember from the class, that's what I recalled. From there, it talks about the R.B.T, which is risk of bias in number or in N of trials. So this one is an assessment of bias or risk of bias assessment, right? It's an assessment to see how much bias is in something. So it's something that exists. They go into further detail of how it works. I didn't write down exactly how it works because it's not something we implement necessarily. It's something that happens elsewhere within like peer reviews and other standardized reviews of articles. And then the other thing that occurs for articles or can occur for an article is called a SCARF, which is for ABA pretty important because it's single case analysis review framework. Now, because ABA mainly focuses on single case design, something like What Works Clearinghouse doesn't actually support the publication of a lot of anything that has single case design. It only works with group designs. So because of that, it kind of creates a disconnect because it's harder to publish something more widespread when it's limited to one type of design over another, right? So a SCARF definitely focuses on the quality, rigor, and outcomes of what the paper is trying to establish. And that being said, it's kind of at odds with What Works Clearinghouse. Not to say What Works Clearinghouse won't allow a publication of a single case design item, just to say that that is something where we're still trying to overcome within the field of ABA as to how effectively our publications can make it to the world at large, because group designs are always going to be preferred over single case designs. Single case designs are very subjective when it comes to the outcomes or results, versus group designs tend to have a lot more broad base. So that's what you'll see. That being said, when an article is going through a standardization process, they're trying to find bias, right? So we're looking for whether or not an article has sort of like selection bias, blinding bias, fidelity, which is to say, does the independent variable, is it accurate? Like, did you actually implement the change in the independent variable as you said you would, or did you actually change something else? Another thing they do is they want to make sure that the data sampling itself is sufficient, right? So if you are doing multiple baselines, did you do enough, right, for yourself that you're trying to say like, this worked in the classroom because like these 3 kids did this, when you could actually have tested like all the kids. So why did you get rid of that extra data if you did take the data, and so forth? And then of course, they want to make sure that your article is reliable. So they look at it, they can see whether or not it makes sense. So does your conclusion reliably follow the data you got? So that's another thing, right? So if your data shows that something worked and then in your discussion you say it didn't, that's unreliable. You can't really, there's clearly a disconnect there. After that, the unit goes into behavioral programs for research. So how do you collect data? Are the procedures that you have applicable? And can you use the same research design to your treatment design, or do you have to think more out of the box? It's basically when you create a program from research, there's a little bit of a disconnect because if something's in a more sterile condition, but you don't have that, right? Ideally we all would, but you won't always have that. Can you actually translate what occurred in the research to real life. So there's a lot of times people have to get creative with it, but sometimes the research actually does it for you. And the research paper is just like, this was performed in a classroom and procedural integrity was ensured because we had like 3 researchers running data at all times, or running the implementing the intervention at all times instead of the teachers, right? So you may have to consider, like, do you have the resources to do that? If not, you may have to get creative with it. You may have to change the metric of which you take the data. These are all things you have to consider when you're making a behavioral program from research, but it's usually doable. And if you get a little lost, you can actually, once again, reach out to the authors of said articles and come up with ideas from that. The unit basically ends on, what is the performance criteria? Like, what are you trying to do with the research at hand? So know what you want, search using the Boolean operatives that we talked about in the previous video, and determine the relevance of that article to what you're doing. It's why they went over the Boolean operatives so specifically, because they do want us to use every single advantage and research out there for us, and our programs are only as good as the literature we base it off of. One thing that the instructor mentioned was, technically, all behavior programs should have a reference section, in all technicality, because it's not like we came up with this stuff on the fly. We heard of it from several other people, so there's a lot of integrity going on, because a lot of people say, like, have you tried this? Because the X, Y, and Z, right? They know it works because of all the research that's been applied to it, but we should be referencing that research within there. So when someone says, hey, do you know why this token economy would work? You can actually directly reference the research article that it's based off of. Don't know why I'm so stuck on token economies for this, but it's a very easy thing to pull from, because it has a lot of data on it and a lot of research. From there, you want to make sure that you can reference it, right? So realistically, it would be nice, in a perfect world, all behavior programs would have a reference section, but of course that's not really efficient for us, because we just know what occurs. But realistically, it's to really push home that we need to be as conceptually systematic as possible and relate everything we do to the 7 main dimensions of ABA, the main one being conceptually systematic. So I hope that explains the rest of Unit 9. I know that there's a lot of kind of different aspects within it, because it's talking about what an article goes through in order to become useful to us. So I hope it's not too confusing. If you have any questions, leave them down below. If you have any comments or corrections, please let me know so I can add them to the description. And until the next video, I'll see you next time.